the college football season, it's on life support, right? Like I just mentioned in the open, the Big Ten on Thursday announced, and then followed that up by the Pac-12 on Friday. They both announced that they were playing conference-only games. So some big-time non-conference matchups like Ohio State, Oregon canceled, Michigan, Washington canceled, USC, Alabama canceled. And now it's just another domino that falls to where college football, again, is closer and closer on the brink of not happening in the fall. And it could be doom and gloom. It could be really, talking and fretting about, we're really not going to have college football this season. You have the SEC Commissioner Greg Sankey over the weekend, who, if you know, at least about the SEC, or if you heard, they are similar to the NFL. They are most similar to the NFL, where they are going to try to push on as business as usual, try to get a season no matter what happens. And even Greg Sankey, the Commissioner of the SEC, said on Saturday that the behavior of those constituents in the states where, the 14 teams reside has made it very difficult to play football in the fall. And he said, quote, "The direct reality is not good." It's really the first time we've heard the SEC commissioner come out and really make a dire plea to say, listen, the season's on life support. So I think it's pretty easy to go out and say, listen, college football may not happen, probably won't happen, and we can discuss that. But I do want to stay positive. I do kind of want to bring some optimism because I feel like for the most part, a lot of the shows that we've done have been realistic, right? I think we're not trying to, tell you something that's not true. We're not trying to give you false hope. I think it's better just to kind of look at things from a realistic perspective. That way, at least when something happens, you're not surprised, maybe disappointed, but it doesn't take you, you're not blindsided by it. It's not surprised by it. And it helps, at least personally me, cope with it a little bit better. But I do want to take this angle from a positive perspective. And that is the fact that, sure, while this is really the last option, right? When you look at the options that college football has to play in the fall, this really is the last one. You really can't do anything else to limit exposure, to try to keep the players as safe as possible without basically canceling the season. But I will say this. The conference-only scheduling, where Big Ten teams will only play Big Ten teams, Pac-12 teams will only play Pac-12 teams. And as we think, most likely to happen, ACC will play ACC, SEC will only play the SEC, and the Big 12 will only play the Big 12. I think this is the best option to get as many games in as possible and keep the players safe as possible. So I want to take an optimistic route because really, when conferences are going, or when conferences announce they're only playing teams within their own conference, this is a lot about travel. This is not about, Ohio State not now having to go to Oregon or USC not going to a neutral site to play Alabama. It's not about travel. It's about testing protocols. Each conference now has the ability to create and uphold their own testing protocols that every school has to abide by. So no matter if you're Penn State, if you're Nebraska, if you're Rutgers or Maryland, you're in the Big Ten, you have to follow the protocols that are laid out by the Big Ten whenever they decide to make those protocols public and whenever they put a plan in place. And as we've seen and as we know, college football especially, there is zero uniformity. It's basically every man for himself. The Big Ten does what the Big Ten does. The Pac-12 can do whatever they want. The SEC does whatever they want. The NCAA really has no bearing, no impact on college football. Don't forget, the college football playoff is run by the conferences and ESPN. The NCAA has no say in it at all. So with that lack of uniformity, with that lack of a commissioner, right? Like as we know, baseball, all the professional sports have a commissioner. Or one guy is a ruling party. He creates the rules and all these teams have to follow the rules. College football, the Big Ten can do what the Big Ten wants to do. The SEC can do what the SEC wants to do. So each conference, in theory, could have different testing protocols, different ways or different requirements to have players healthy. And guess what? Even if it's a Big Ten team playing a Pac-12 team, that still creates some situations where you are possibly exposing players to where one side is testing more than the other, and you could allow for tests or players that are asymptomatic to slip in and get other players on the other team sick. So now, at least, you are requiring every team is going to be on the same playing field no matter what. No matter if you're the ACC, the Big 12, the Pac-12, the Big 10, the SEC, every team that's going to be playing each other is going to have the same amount of testing done. It's going to be done the same day. It's going to have the same requirements for you to play on Saturday. You will have to pass these certain tests. So I think it brings, it at least allows to weed out as many players that are sick as possible to prevent them from getting on the field. And I personally believe it keeps the players safe as possible. And we're just looking at this from the Power 5 perspective. Don't forget, a lot of these teams play FCS teams, Group of 5 teams, and they pay a lot of these small-time teams to play games. And guess what? These big Power 5 conferences we're talking about, they might not have the same testing protocols, but they'll have the same money to test. They'll have the budgets to test as much as they need to. For these smaller programs, for these schools that, football, sure, helps pay for a lot of the athletic department, but it's not a moneymaker where they're not packing in 100,000 fans into a stadium. They can't afford to have the same testing. So in teams like Penn State, I'll use them for example, since I'm my alma mater, if you can tell by the polo I'm wearing today. They're supposed to play Kent State. They're supposed to play San Jose State this year. San Jose State and Kent State don't have the same budget to test as often and frequently as a team like Penn State does. So now by playing those games, you're just risking your own team getting sick because the protocols for one team aren't the same as the other. There's no blanket requirements to play. So in theory, these smaller teams can test once a week, once every other week, test only when there's symptoms, and there's a greater variance for players who take the field that are asymptomatic and get sick. So to me, it's safer to only play games within your own conference because that way you can ensure every team that takes the field is following some sort of protocol that their conference and their respective conference set up. So I think it's safer from that perspective, not to mention less games equals more schedule flexibility. You need to have flexibility now more than ever. So if you're playing 8 conference games, 9 conference games, even possibly 10 conference games compared to a normal 12-game season, it adds an extra 2 or 3 bye weeks that you can have to use. If a game gets canceled, you can schedule it later on. You can maybe even wait a week if you have to and move the game back to ensure that all the players are healthy and coronavirus negative before taking the field. I think a great example of this, you had Ohio State Athletic Director Gene Smith, who's been very vocal, very out in front. He's been very optimistic so far up to this point in saying we're going to have a college football season. Remember him a few months ago saying we expect Ohio State can have up to 50% capacity, which is like 50,000 fans, which seemed outrageous at the time. And as we see, that's very, very, very unlikely. But even he said, going to a conference on the schedule, he said, quote, "We can hit the pause button and provide a window of opportunity for our student athletes to not be put at risk. We can move games. There's a flexibility. I can't say that enough. That's significant," end quote. It's about flexibility. It's about having extra weeks available so that if a game does have to get canceled, you can make it up and it's not a lost game. If there is one conference, or there is one conference that's most likely to get left out, it's the Pac-12. Let's just look at it, first of all, from a contender perspective. Overall, right? You look at the SEC. How many teams can legitimately contend for a college football playoff? I think 3. I think you could put Alabama. I think you could put Georgia. And I do think you could put Florida in that mix. I think it would be no shock if Florida makes a run, beats Georgia, beats Alabama, and goes to the college football playoff. I really like what Florida's doing. They're bringing back Kyle Trask, who's now going to have a full year as a starter. I like what Florida's building. So 3 teams, legitimately, right now in the preseason. Doesn't mean one can't emerge. Doesn't mean Auburn can't, go on one of their runs where all of a sudden they wake up and are force, which, as you know, Auburn's, one of the most hot or cold teams in college football. But right now, legitimately, realistically, 3 teams. Alabama, Georgia, and Florida. Go to the Big Ten. I think it's 2 teams. Ohio State, obviously, and I think Penn State's right in that mix. Penn State and Florida, to me, are the same. They play the team that's always stood in front of them. For Florida, it's going to be Georgia. For Penn State, it's going to be Ohio State. Win those games. They're closing the talent gap. Win that game, and you're in. Take care of business the rest of the way, you're in. So I think for the Big Ten, there's 2 legitimate teams that can get in, Penn State and Ohio State, 3 from the SEC. So right there, when you have more than one team, your chances increase heavy to make the playoff. All you need is 1. And there are 3 conferences I look at with only 1 team that can legitimately have a chance to get in. ACC, obviously, is Clemson. Big 12, Oklahoma. And for me, the Pac-12, that team's Oregon. So now, okay, if you look at it this way, numbers game, the SEC is guaranteed to get in. Big 10, same thing. Numbers-wise, you have a better chance. So now, for the ACC, the Big 12, and the Pac-12, you're relying on 1 team. All your eggs are in 1 basket. So now it comes down to, when you have 3 teams for 2 spots, who do you trust more to get it done? Clemson, shoo-in. ACC's already covered. Clemson's going to get in. Even if they lose to, let's say, a Notre Dame, possibility happening, depending on how the schedule works out. ACC is a shoo-in. Clemson's in. Big 12, same thing. Oklahoma has tripped up in the past. Push comes to shove. When they go and get stuff, they made the playoff 3 times in a row. I think it'll be 4 times in a row. New quarterback, doesn't matter. Lincoln Riley produces offense, produces wins. I don't really see anyone else in the Big 12 giving Oklahoma too much of a scare. I think Oklahoma gets in. So for me, it comes down to not trusting Oregon enough. I don't. I trust Oregon the least out of Clemson and Oklahoma to get the job done. They have a new quarterback. They have a great team, a great roster, especially on the lines. What Mario Cristobal is doing, strengthening the offensive line, strengthening the defensive line, Oregon is going to be a different Oregon team than we're used to under Chip Kelly. They're going to be physical. They're going to punch you in the mouth, and they are going to be power heavy compared to speed and quickness that we're used to seeing with Marcus Mariota, with DeAnthony Thomas, with all these other skilled running backs and receivers that Oregon flourished with when they first really came to prominence under Chip Kelly. So you're breaking in a new quarterback. You have no spring ball to do so. You have no summer to get the reps in. So now whenever they decide to start training camp, it's going to be learn on the fly, trying to get Tyler Shuck, their new quarterback, kind of, in the system and learning. To me, that's a lot to ask for a new quarterback to get them to the playoff. I trust Oregon. I trust the Pac-12, the least, to get everything together and make a playoff run. Because guess what? Also, on top of just not trusting Oregon more than Oklahoma and Clemson, which I think that's not a hot take at all. No one is going to take Oregon to overtake Oklahoma or Clemson. But on top of that, the Pac-12 absolutely notorious for killing itself. Last year is the perfect example of whether you want parity in your conference or whether you want one dominant team in your conference. For the Pac-12, they've had a lot of parity, which if you're a fan of a team in that league, that's great because it's exciting. Really, any team can win any night. And you can go into a season for most of the teams and say, we have a chance to win the Pac-12 North, Pac-12 South, and get to a Pac-12 title game. And last year, speaking of killing itself, is the perfect example of the Pac-12 not getting out of their own way, hurting their national reputation, and missing the playoff yet again. Last year, the Pac-12 had two teams that were bound to go to the playoff, Oregon and Utah. Second to last week of the season, the weekend right before Thanksgiving, Arizona State at home upsets Oregon. Oregon's second loss. There goes the Ducks' chances of going to the playoff. But it's okay. Because if you're a Pac-12 fan that wants to make the playoff, if you're a Pac-12 fan that wants some national notoriety, okay, the Utah taking care of business. They had a slip up against USC, but other than that, they're winning, they're dominating, they're looking good, they're climbing the rankings. All Utah has to do is beat Oregon in the Pac-12 title game, and Utah's going to the playoff. Instead, what happens? Oregon beats Utah. Oregon dominates Utah. And now, all of a sudden, the Pac-12 yet again misses out on the playoff, hurts themselves on the national level, and misses out. And you look at the Pac-12 this year, it's tricky. I just talked about the parity in the conference. It is tricky. USC is going to have an electric offense. They're returning their quarterback. They're returning, more importantly, Graham Harrell, their offensive coordinator. They're going to be slinging the ball over the yard. They have great receivers. They're going to be a tough out. I love what Arizona State is doing. I love what Herm Edwards is building down there. Like I said, you saw they had a great upset win over Oregon last year. Jane Daniels is going to be a sophomore now. I really do like what Arizona State's building. They're going to be a tough team. Cal is always a tough out. They have a great hard-nosed defense, grind it out on offense. But they are a very well-coached team, and they are one of those teams that's always pesky no matter what year, no matter what the talent level is. They're a tough out. So it's going to be a tricky year for Oregon to get through this season undefeated, to try to have a better resume than either Oklahoma or Clemson. And finally, this is maybe the most important factor. Because you're only playing your own conference. Because the conferences can't, your strength of schedule can't be helped by playing out-of-conference games, playing big out-of-conference games. Your reputation as a conference is going to be relied upon more than ever. And guess what? If you're the Pac-12, that's a major issue. They made the playoff twice in 6 years. Just twice. Oregon the first year, and you had Washington back in 2016. Well, every other conference has had a lot of success making the playoff. The next closest to making the playoff least amount is them. Big 10 and Big 12 both have made it 4 times. So doubles what the Pac-12 has had, let alone the ACC and the SEC making it every year. So more than ever, you're going to need conference reputation to give maybe a team the benefit of the doubt. To where if it comes down to Oklahoma and Oregon, they're right there neck and neck. Oklahoma, because they've been a playoff team in the past, because the Big 12 has gotten it done. You have to think Oklahoma would get the nod over Oregon just on reputation alone.